All right. Well, we're 5 minutes, 6 minutes after the hour, so let's we'll get started. Thank you for everyone that is here so far. Um, let's see. Is there anybody on that would like to volunteer to give an opening prayer? Everybody's volunteering at once.
I'll say it, Bishop.
Thank you very much.
Our dear, kind, gracious Heavenly Father, we are very grateful for this wonderful day that we've had, and we are grateful for this wonderful Start Youth Conference. And please help us today that during this fireside, we will be able to feel the Spirit and open our hearts to it. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so little introduction for our speaker tonight. Brother Russell C. Rasmussen is my brother. He also has a PhD in instructional design and technology from Brigham Young University, so he's a doctor. He's very important that way.
The fake kind.
He did some study in the American University in Cairo, and his undergraduate study was in Near Eastern Studies. So he speaks Arabic and has a lot of experience in those types of things. He worked for many years as a director of visitor centers, pageants, and historic sites for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And as part of that, did a lot of different projects with visitor centers. If any of you have been to the Mormon Battalion in San Diego, that was his design. If you've been to the Salt Lake Visitor Center and you've seen that cutaway model of the Salt Lake Temple, he directed that. So lots of different things that you may have been exposed to. He's had his hands in over the years. He's been a bishop. He served on the Sunday School General Board, and he taught religion at BYU part-time for several years. He's married, has 5 children, including 2 4-year-old twins, and I'm really excited for this presentation because I think you'll be amazed at some of the stuff. So thank you, Russ, for spending your evening with us.
All right. How's it going, everyone? My whole goal tonight, honestly, is to keep David and Aiden awake for longer than 5 minutes. So I've got a bunch of pictures and some stories to tell you. But the thing that I want is if I say something or I show a picture and you're curious about it, and you want to know a little bit more, just speak up. Just say, hey, what's that? And I don't understand that. And why did you do that? That kind of thing. Okay. So feel free to jump in there if you want. So the project that your bishop asked me to talk about tonight was the Rome Temple Visitor Center. As he said, I worked for the church for 12 years and got to work on a lot of fun and exciting projects. And so I thought specifically we'd talk about the Rome Temple project, and more specifically, the visitor center and the statues that were created that went inside of that visitor center. Because there was some pretty awesome things that happened in those statues coming about, the whole project and experience. The bishop told me that your theme was on receiving light and continuing in God. So revelation and how that comes to you and continuing to have yourself in light. So some of the stories I'm going to tell tonight are just a few of the little things that happened along the way. There, if we cataloged all of them, there were just a ton of little things and people and experiences that had to come into play in order for this to happen, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise. There were too many variables to not let this thing go forward, and thankfully it did. So I thought I would just start with the basic story. when in 2008, when President Monson announced that we were going to build a temple in Rome, you know, there was an audible gasp from the crowd. And one of the interesting things is immediately people, if you know anything about Rome, you think, oh, that's the Catholic Church, and oh, they've got this place called the Vatican. That's where the Pope lives. That's where one of their largest cathedrals is, the St. Peter's Basilica. And so, are we going to build the temple right next door to this big thing? And the truth is no. Rome has a big ring road that goes all the way around the outside of it, and anything inside of the ring road is considered Rome. And the temple is at the very top north, just right inside the ring road. It's closer to the IKEA than to anything else. Okay, so that's where it's positioned, but it's considered in Rome just because of where it's positioned. So one of the people that was very instrumental in this experience, and again, was Niels Valentiner. He was the principal architect for the Rome Temple complex. And one of the reasons why it's interesting for him to be involved is the story I'm going to tell you here, is his background and where he grew up, and all those things came into play to tell us a story that led us down a certain path. Now, Niels owns an architectural firm called VCBO in Salt Lake City, and they've done tons of projects. I mean, schools, universities, commercial buildings, and religious types of things like temples. And so he was awarded the opportunity to work on the Rome Temple. Niels was born in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and actually served a mission there as well. And one of the fun things that I learned later on in the fact was that he served at the same time as your bishop and I's dad served in Denmark. And so they knew each other, and we got a chance to reconnect with regards to that. But when we first sat down to talk about the Rome Temple complex, so you can see there were 4 buildings that were actually built. There's the temple, which is on the left there, the visitor center directly across from it. Then there was a chapel that was also built. And then this other building is called patron housing. So because there aren't a lot of members that live close to the temple complex, they needed a place for some people to stay when they came to do temple work or other things. And so that gives them a chance for a place to stay instead of in a hotel or something like that. But Niels was in charge of designing all of this. And my part specifically dealt with the visitor center. And so we sat down in one of our first meetings, and he said, hey, have you ever, he goes, do you know the story of the original Krista statue that you see in the Salt Lake Temple Visitor Center? And where that came from? And I said, yeah, I'm relatively familiar with it. There was a guy by the name of Bertel Thorvaldsen, who was Danish, and he is the one who created this Krista statue. How it came into our lives as members of the church was in about 1950, Stephen L. Richards, who was a member of the First Presidency, was on a tour in Europe, and he happened to be in Denmark, and they took him to see the statue, and he just really loved it. He was taken by it. And so he came back to Salt Lake, and he said, hey, we want to commission one of these. We want an artist to try to make something kind of like that. And they weren't sure exactly what they were going to do with it, but they ended up making a few, and one of them ended up in the Salt Lake Visitor Center, and one of them ended up in Los Angeles at a cemetery, and one of them ended up in the Los Angeles Visitor Center. So there were a couple of them that were made. And how they made them back in those days was basically someone would take pictures of this and take measurements, and then they would take a big block of marble and they would kind of sketch out those measurements, and then they would, looking at that picture or at the sculpture itself, make one as close as they could to the experience. So that's generally how they did it. It takes a long time, very hard to do, not exactly the same in terms of how it's made. And so I was saying to Niels in this meeting, I'm like, yeah, we've heard all that story. We're very familiar with it. Let's see. Yes, I had been to Copenhagen and seen those statues. So he said, yeah, but do you know where he made them? And I said, nope. I said, I figured he just made them there in Copenhagen. That's why they were there. And he said, no, actually, he was up here in Copenhagen in Denmark. And when he was in his early 20s, he got a commission to move to Italy, down here in the south, as you can see, to Rome, and to be an artist. And so someone was paying his way to do that. He came from a poor family, so it wasn't like he had that backing, but he had some talent. So they moved him down here, and he actually spent most of his life in Italy. He was born in Denmark, and he died in Denmark, but the majority of his life he spent in Italy. He was born in about 1770 and died in I don't remember exactly, 1843, 1845, something like that. So he'd lived for quite a long time, but he spent most of his time in Italy. And what Niels Valentiner told us in this meeting was, he said he was living in Italy when the Danish government came to him and said, for our national church, we want you to make some sculptures of Christ and of the 12 apostles. And he said, okay, as long as you're paying me, I'm happy to do it. So they commissioned him to make these statues for the national church there in Denmark. And so he carved them in Italy and then had them shipped back to Copenhagen to be installed in the church that was there. And that's the part of the story I hadn't known. I didn't know that they were out of Italy. They were out of a particular marble called Carrara marble. And so what Niels was saying, he was saying, how great would it be that we're building a visitor center in Rome, that we try to make similar statues and put them in the Rome Temple Visitor Center. And we thought it was an awesome idea. And so we actually took that idea up to the Quorum of the 12 in the First Presidency and just initially and said, hey, this is what we're thinking. And they thought it was a great idea. Now, the problem is we'd actually never done anything like that before and had no idea how to do it. And you couldn't Google a website or YouTube video and go, oh, okay, yeah, that's how you make big, large marble statues. There's nothing like that. So we had to, through the process of study and prayer and looking for options, to find out how to actually do this particular thing. This is the church in Denmark, the national church where those statues are. So it just gives you a quick glance of it, and then I'll show you inside. So this is inside the main hall. You'll notice the very end is the Christus statue, and then the 12 apostles line the outside of this of the main corridor of the cathedral here. You can't tell it from the pictures, but these statues are what are called heroic size. So if you have miniature, and then you have normal human size, and then you have heroic size, which is generally 1.5 times the size of what a human would be. So most of these statues are about 10 feet tall, and they sit on about a 4 to 5 foot pedestal. So they're huge. And the Christus at the end there is even larger, stands on a larger pedestal, and is about 14 feet high as opposed to 10 feet high. So he told us, Niels Valentiner told us that awesome story. We got initial approval to explore it by the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency. And so we start down the road of saying, okay, great. Now how do we do this? So there's another person who came into play, and you'll never hear this guy's name ever on any news report, on anything. This gentleman, Bjørn, was a university professor in Copenhagen. And he had, previous to us contacting him, had befriended the caretaker, the curator person over that national cathedral. So anything that happened in that cathedral had to go through this individual. And there was a board of people that approved whether or not certain things would happen. And on initial asking, they told us absolutely not. You can't come in and scan or measure these statues or anything, because, they're ours, and we don't want another church taking control or possession of these. Well, Bjørn, who was a member of the church, spent about 4 years just being friends and showing encouragement to the curator and just really helping them understand the reasons why we wanted to be in there and what we could do to help them preserve these statues. And at the end of the day, it was only because of this individual, again, who you'll never hear about, which is why we had the opportunity to do what we did. they finally agreed to let us come in and scan the statues. So we had all the legal documents drawn up, and the part that was, well, the negotiation part was, they said, well, you know, if these statues were ever damaged, they're irreplaceable. And so with the work that you're going to do by measuring them and scanning them and all this work, if you'll give us all of that data and all that information, so that if by chance something gets damaged, you know, there was a fire recently in the church, which is a little bit of a joke, because if you've ever been to Europe, when they say recently, it had happened in the 1800s. So that wasn't too recent to us, but for them, that was recent. They said if that ever happens and these statues were burned or broken, we couldn't replace them. So that was our big agreement, is we were going to give all this data to them. So Bern helped us with that initial relationship. Once they agreed on that, then it was, okay, now we got to figure out how to scan these things. So here's just a better up close shot of the Christus statue. This is an angel. Bertel Thorvaldsen also did that carving. But then here are each of the 12 apostles. We'll just give you a quick look at them. You'll notice that some of them are holding certain things. Anyone have any idea why they're holding the particular items they are? Because it was fun. What most of them signified is what type of apostle they were or how they died. So it's back here, for Bartholomew, who was holding a dagger, he was killed by a dagger. Judas Thaddeus, which is not Judas Iscariot, he was killed by, I don't even know what those things are called. But you'll recognize, let me find, oh, and out of all that, I don't even have Peter in there. Okay, well, I missed Peter. Peter's holding a set of keys, and his was indicative of what his responsibility was as an apostle. So we had all these statues, and part of the challenge was, before even scanning, is one of the reasons I forgot to say this, when we took this into the Quorum of the 12 and the presidency, is we said, they're all holding these symbols and things that either we don't believe in the church, you know, like we don't have a cross as a symbol within the church, but here's Philip holding a cross. And so what do we do with that? And after a lot of discussion, the First Presidency said, you know what, it's not a big deal. It represents something relative to the apostles. So let's go ahead and we'll scan and make these statues exactly like they are. So we said, great. That gave us the go-ahead. It helped that they had a little miniature set of these sitting in the First Presidency office, so it was easy for them to refer to. So scanning. We had used a certain technology to scan. When we did the Salt Lake Temple model, we used a certain technology called a LiDAR scanner, which stands for light detection and ranging. And most of you won't care about that, other than if you saw the new iPhone announcement, they're going to come with LiDAR scanning technology built into the iPhone. And you're like, what the heck is that for? Well, what it is LiDAR scanners is a pulsed laser that pulses out like this. And because it can measure the length of light that it shoots out, whenever it hits something solid, it bounces that back and it can tell you depth. So on an iPhone, right now, when you're doing something like augmented reality, where you hold up your camera and it shows you some image within a physical environment, right now your phone can't tell the depth in those things. It just puts the image out there. And if you were to stick your hand in there, it would look really weird because it can't tell the depth. Well, with a LiDAR scanner in your iPhone that's coming in this next round, it will be able to place it depth-wise. So, for example, there's a wall across from here from me, and it would be able to show me images and objects within that. Well, the reason we used the LiDAR scanner originally, and we actually bought one, because we were doing this model of the Salt Lake Temple, and this is the actual picture of the model, and you can see all of these turrets up here at the top and all this intricate detail. Creating that 3D wise was just going to take a ton of time and a ton of money. And the LiDAR scanner allowed us, we actually stood on the top of the temple and on the outside, And this scanner would send out these light impulses and bounce back, and it would give us a three-dimensional data set for what that temple looked like, without having to do what most people did when they're doing 3D scanning, which is they have to put out reference objects because it can't tell the distance or relationship to things. So you have to put all these reference objects, and then the scanner scans it, and then in your program you put it all together. Well, a LiDAR scanner allowed us to just scan, get all that data, and be able to use it. So what we did on the Salt Lake Temple here is, for example, you see this big turret here in the back. We scanned that, and then we pumped that data into a 3D printer, and it printed out those turrets for us. And that's how we were able to build most of the model of the temple. And then we had this awesome little 700-year-old Russian man from Toronto, Canada, paint this for us. I sent him a block of the Salt Lake Temple, the same stone, and he was able to basically color it that way, which is pretty amazing. So anyway, the LiDAR scanner, the reason I tell you that is we're like, great, we got this all settled. We're going to take this LiDAR scanner into this church in Denmark. We're going to set it up. It'll probably take us 3 days. We're going to scan each of the statues. We'll have all the data. So to practice, we went over to the North Visitor Center in Temple Square, where the Christus is, and I unfortunately didn't put a picture in of that. But we scanned it just as a test case, and it worked great. And so we're like, okay, this is awesome. And right before we went over, so I took 2 gentlemen over with me. And one of them is another person. I didn't get a picture of him. I wanted to. His name's Marty Havron, and he was very instrumental in helping us through the process. He's actually a digital artist, a 3D artist for Pixar. And so most of the Pixar movies you've seen come out, he has had characters or other things that he's drawn for those. He's very, very talented, and he just knows 3D very well. But right before we left, he said, what are we going to do as a backup plan if the LiDAR scanner doesn't work? And I said, what do you mean if it doesn't work? And he goes, I don't know. There's just, different properties and materials and stuff. We ought to have a backup plan. So as a backup plan, we got a couple of hand scanners that use a little different technology when you're scanning. They have to have reference points in order to scan with. And so we're like, okay, so we packed that stuff, and Doug and Marty and I went over to Copenhagen thinking we were going to be there for 3 to 4 days and get all this stuff done. Well, when we got there, what ended up happening was that we set up the LiDAR scanner, and we started to scan the first statue. And the data that was coming in looked really weird. Like it wasn't showing you what you thought you were scanning. And so we thought we had calibration off, we messed around with it, we made a bunch of changes, we scan again, it still looks bad. What we found out was that the stone of the Christus in the Salt Lake Temple, or the Salt Lake Visitor Center, is completely different from the stone of the Christus and the other statues in Copenhagen. It has a little bit, it's called Carrara marble, and it has a little bit of translucency to it. So when the laser was supposed to bounce off the edge of it and show us what it looked like, it was actually shining inside of that marble. And so we were just getting these weird images. And that was one of those thankful, revelatory, hey, we probably ought to do this backup plan, because what ended up happening is we had to put on reference things for each of the statues. And that may seem like a simple thing, but this is me, and there's Marty up in the top right. This is all Marty, actually. This is me. We're putting tiny little reflective dots on these statues. We had to put them in, they were about 2 fingers apart over this whole statue. So we started adding dots, because using these hand scanners, that was the only way to get the detail. So we added some dots, and then we added some more dots, and then we added some more dots. And this is what they looked like when we got the dots on them, because you actually couldn't see that with your naked eye because they're reflective. So it was a little bit funny, because the cathedral was still open when we were doing this work, and tourists would come in and they'd look at what we were doing, and they, oh great, and they'd take a picture and they'd look at their camera, and when they'd take the picture, it would show all these reflective dots, and so they thought that the statues had chickenpox or something. But what we did is we had to end up putting all these reference dots on the statues and then taking them off against once we'd scanned the statues. And so what was supposed to be a 3 to 4 day experience ended up being about 3.5 weeks that it took us to do this. And even with that 3.5 weeks, another miraculous thing happened that we couldn't have accomplished in that time had we not had some help. About day 2, when we were only halfway through this first statue here on the left, I said, there's no way we're going to make this. We need help. And it was hard to find people to hire to come in and help us do this. And so we just started asking around to the stake presidents in the area and saying, do you know anyone that needs, needs a volunteer opportunity and would like to come in and help us? And they went to the university and ended up recruiting 5 university students who were members of the church to come in. And these 5 folks were absolutely fantastic, because most of the work we did, we had to do between 9 at night and 5 in the morning, because they didn't want all the scaffolding and things up during the day. And so they would come and they would stay all night with us and put these dots on. And then once you take the dots off, you'd have to clean them up because they would go everywhere. And they helped us in a huge way. They were a massive blessing to us in that process, because we couldn't have done it without them. So we were very grateful for that. We ended up having to put about 1,500 dots on each apostle and about 3,000 on the Christus statue. And it just was an enormous task for us to do. So I'll then show you what we did once we put the dots on. So it took us about 18 to 20 hours per statue. And I told you the size of these before. The Christus is 14 feet. The apostles are 10 feet. They're massive. So we had to use scaffolding. And what we would do is, you see Marty there. He has the hand scanner next to him, and then a computer. And then you can see Marty with the hand scanner on the foot here of one of the apostles. And this is Doug scanning the top half. And basically they would scan, and that data would go into a computer. And I'll show you how that did that. So here's myself and Doug scanning the face of the Christus. And you see, as we would scan it, it would start to fill in that data on the machine, so we could see what we were scanning and what definition we were getting off of that scan. And it was a pretty amazing process to go through, to watch that data be brought into the experience. One of the things that's interesting about that scanning, here's just another picture of, that's Doug up there. There's Niels and Doug and Marty again. One of the interesting things about that scan is, when we first started, the resolution was too high. When you do these 3D scans, it creates these little triangles, these polygons you can see. And the way that it puts those together is how it creates these mesh structures in 3D data, so that you can use them for printing or other things. And we started out where each statue was a couple 100 million polygons. It was like terabytes of data. It was just so gargantuan that it was hard to work with. And after some discussion, we figured we probably didn't need that high of resolution. So we knocked it down to where each statue was about 10 million of these little polygons put together to make up the statue. But one of the challenges we had was, for example, all those statues are up against the wall. And we couldn't get the hand scanner behind on the back side of the statue. So you can see here with Matthew, on the left is what we were able to scan, and we're missing a bunch of his robe because we just couldn't get back there. And so what Marty and another gentleman helped us with was going in and building those polygons out for the back of the statues that we couldn't get access to, and to smooth them out so it was time, so that when we were ready to actually create them, that we had a full sculpted statue. So the next big challenge was, though, so great, we scanned the statues. It took us 3.5 weeks. We got this amazing data. By the way, we did something kind of fun for those 5 university students. We couldn't pay them by law because, anyway, nobody cares about that. But I was talking to them one day, and they were talking about iPads. And this is back in 2009. And so if iPads were newer, and they were double the price in Copenhagen to purchase one. They were just crazy expensive. Nobody could afford them. And we got talking about an iPad one night, and I thought, man, I wonder if I could get some of those shipped over for these guys. And they were hard to find because they were a hot commodity. But I sent a friend out, and he went all over Salt Lake and Utah valleys and found me 5 iPads and shipped them over. And on the last day, we gave each of these university students an iPad for helping out with the project, which they were pretty excited about. So we have all this awesome data. The part we hadn't figured out is how we're going to get this awesome data into statues, because we wanted to make the statues out of marble. And I had done a bunch of Christus statues for different visitor centers and temple open house projects. And basically what we do is we had a mold that was made of the Christus statue, and then they would pour this resin and crushed marble thing into the mold, and then once that was cured, they'd take that off and trim off the excess edges, and then we'd have a Christus statue, which wasn't very heavy, but that we could, you know, put around in different visitor centers or other things. Well, we wanted to make these things out of marble, which, how do you find someone who does that? And so our thought was, well, maybe we could take the data and print it out into a full-size Christus that we want, and the apostles, and then we would find an artist and they would have the printed one, and then they could have a block of marble and they could do a one-to-one. The project at the time, which is funny now because it ended up taking 11 years before the temple dedication, but at the time, a lot of times when we went to build a temple, we had a lot of resistance from governments, from neighborhoods, whatever, just saying, we don't want this, this is going to be an eyesore, it's going to increase traffic, all the reasons why they could come up with to stop us building the temple. We thought we were going to hit a ton of that in Rome because we're in Rome. It's the center of Catholicism. Who wants us there? And but because of some relationships that you might know, the presiding Bishop Cosset, he's French, but he and some others had some great relationships with those in Italy. And because of that, man, we went through the approval process so quick that we were like, wow, we got to have this thing. This has got to be done because this is going to be built fast. Well, a couple years down the road, that ended up getting sidetracked, not by the Vatican or anything, but just by the project and the contractor that was originally scheduled to build all these things. Just some problems there. But I tell you that simply to say is we felt like we were against the gun in terms of getting these done in time, and so the thought of having a sculptor do 13 of these statues in marble was impossible. They just weren't going to get it done in time. So Marty had heard about a thing, technology that we went to explore, and it was called, I'll show you a little bit of this later, but it's called CNC routing. And if you ever heard of that, all that stands for is computer numerical calculations. And what that means is a computer can take information and using a tool, right, a tool that has a spinning head on it called a router, it can move to specific locations on wood or glass or anything you want, and it will make whatever picture you've got, right? So that's what they do. Well, we learned that there were CNC routers that would do that with marble. And we thought, well, can it do it at the size we want? Because we're talking about huge statues that we're making here. And we found that there actually were several companies around the world. So what I did was I had to do a test. I wanted to figure out who could actually do this and how well they could do it. So I sent them the data for Peter's head, and I sent it on the bottom of the screen there. You can see I sent it to a company in Minneapolis, in Shanghai, China, in Bangalore, India, in Copenhagen, Denmark, and in Carrara, Italy. We had, through different connections and associations, found these different companies that said they had this capability. And so I said to them, here's the original statue on the left, and then here is the scanned data that we rendered once we had that done. And I sent it to all of them, and I said, I want you to send me a stone head of Peter, and I want to see what it looks like. Well, part of the challenge is this was one of the test cases that came back, and you'll notice that half of the face looks different than the other. The side on the left side was all done by the machine, and the machine could only get so intricate on the detail, like the beard and the mustache and the hair. And so what each company had to do is I said, I want the whole thing machined, and then I want you to take half of the head and I want you to hand finish it so I can see how your work is in terms of hand finishing it. So I had those 5 companies send me a bust of Peter and do that particular thing. And one of the cool things is, after all those companies sent them back, it was obvious that the company that we ended up choosing, who did the very best job and actually were the most affordable for us, happened to be in Carrara, Italy. And the awesome part about that is the original stone statues in Copenhagen came from the Carrara, Italy mine. And so we found a company that was in the exact same mine and could use the same materials to make the statues that we wanted. And we thought that was honestly pretty miraculous. So the company we went with was a company called Tor Art out of Carrara, Italy. And this is kind of what your bishop, I think he took this shot. This is on top of the mountain in Carrara, looking out to the ocean, Mediterranean Sea. And then on the right is the Carrara mine. And it's really, really hard to tell scale there, but down here in this little left corner is a massive backhoe. This mine has been running since the ancient Roman Empire. That's how it is massive, and it's not going to run out of stone anytime soon. They've been pulling stone from this thing for so long that some of the most famous architectural structures and statues that you may have heard of before actually came from this mine. Here's a couple of them. On the left, the David statue, if you've ever heard of that, it's a very, very famous Michelangelo statue in Florence, Italy. That came out of Carrara, Italy, the same mine. The Pieta, which is it's a sculpture of Mary after Jesus was taken down off the cross and he's laying on her lap. That was done by Michelangelo, also out of the Carrara marble mine. And then there's a big Greek, what used to be Greek temple that now is Catholic, called the Pantheon in Rome, and it was all built out of Carrara marble. So you'll see a lot of these things around. But to make it even more fun for us, the original Christus and the 12 apostles were out of that same stone, and now we were going to go to the same mine and quarry stone out of the same place where these things came from and build them for the Rome Temple Visitor Center. This is just trying to give you an idea of some of the scale. There's a massive backhoe and these big front end loaders, and they use a process where they use these diamond bit chains, and these things basically slice down through this marble and they pull it off in massive chunks. The blocks that we got were about 16 tons a piece. And to give you an equation, if you don't, in spite of what you might think, I do not even weigh 1 ton. If you were to take a 200-pound person, it would take 160 of 200-pound people to make up 16 tons. It's about 32,000 pounds. It'd take about 10 or 11 mid-sized cars to make up the weight of that. So these are just massive, massive blocks. And they would take those blocks and they would put them on a platform like this. So that's a big piece of Carrara marble. And then off to the right, this thing right here is the CNC router. And it had these big diamond bit heads on them because diamond is really strong. And so what it would do is, you can see right there, there's a big stone piece of marble, and it's using water to keep the head of that diamond bit cool, because it gets really hot fast as it spins. And it's routing out, based off of computer data that we put into it, it's going through and it's routing out all of that sculpture. So here are just some of the different diamond bits they use. They use these larger ones when they're working from the outside, and then when they get down and closer, they start using the finer bits. Here was our Christus statue that the routing had started on. You can see it's partway through, and he's still got a shoulder piece done there. But that is using that CNC router and how the Christus statue started to come out of this massive block of stone. And then, I don't know if you know any of these people, but we got to go and have a chance to look at these. Once they were done, they were still at Tor Art in the facility in Carrera. And so your bishop and Sister Rasmussen and Karsten, if some of you know him, we were over there and got to see all of the statues. They were done. We were there in 2013, and the Rome Temple Visitor Center didn't open until 2019. So if that tells you how much time there was in between what we were doing. But the statues, these are some of the apostles that were there. The bishop and I were standing next to once they were done. And then you might remember that unprecedented, the whole first presidency and quorum of the 12 went to the temple dedication and had an opportunity to take a picture in front of all of these statues. And they talk about it. I pulled some quotes, but I left them. They all talk about it in an amazing way, just how amazing it was to be there together as a quorum and to recognize that this ancient set of apostles and Christ who was leading them was in Rome, where some of the initial things of Christianity happened, and then to have the living apostles and prophets standing there with them. It's a pretty amazing thing. So the thing that I would hope that you would get from some of the story that we told here is just simply that just like Niels Valentin or Baron Free or Marty Havron, they all played a role in this experience, which most people will never hear their names, but they were little miracles that happened all the way around for us, so that this was the end result, and the amazing, the amazing things that happened in that Heavenly Father can use you if you're willing to be used. If you're willing to have more light and revelation in your life, Heavenly Father will want to use you. And you might think that it's not significant, but it will be in these small ways. You might be a Burn Free who has a relationship with someone that helps to open up the door for someone else hearing the gospel. It can be as simple as that, but it's those type of things where whenever we're willing to have Heavenly Father guide and direct us, He can use us in the small and simple ways. The end result is something amazing and beautiful, and we get to be a part of that experience. Bishop, any questions or anything that anyone has?
That was awesome. Let me just...
He's not biased at all, people.
So a couple of questions, or maybe helping with clarification. So you talked earlier about how the original statues are heroic size, but I know... Oh. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so what size are these? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Just clarify for them.
So the Christus statue is about 14 feet. We kept him about the same size, but we didn't have the space or ability to put all the apostles at their heroic size. So they're all about 5 feet 9 inches high, and then they're on some pedestals, and I think the pedestals are 3 feet high. And you think about it, are these the original 12? Would there be somebody who you think would be missing from this?
Judas. Say it louder.
Judas.
Right. So Judas was obviously not a part of this. And so in place of it, Thorvaldsen did a statue of Paul the Apostle. So Paul is the 12th apostle in this setup. And the cross back here, we broke that on installation, so we got to repair that. That was nice. Here's Peter on the left side. He's holding the keys, representing the keys of Revelation and the priesthood keys that helped to direct the church, the ones that he held at the time and that were passed down to the living prophets and apostles.
There's a great story told by President Kimball when he was visiting the original statue in Copenhagen, and he was talking to a janitor, wasn't he?
Yep.
And he said,
Oh, yeah.
I hold those keys today. And it just bore testimony that he was the living prophet.
It's pretty awesome. So one of the times when we were doing a presentation for the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency, I couldn't haul the marble statues into Salt Lake, obviously. Oh, you can't even see that. But because we had the 3D data, the company in Tor Art also had the ability to print. And so they printed a 3-foot Christus for me out of that crushed marble resin. And it is the only one in the dang world that exists. When I left church employment, they said, is there anything you want to take with you? And I said, I only want to take one thing. I said, I want to take that. And they let me take it with them. So I just love this because it is an exact replica of that statue in Denmark. One of the things too, I didn't put this picture up there, but we scanned the Salt Lake Christus, which was done by hand, and then we scanned the one that we did through these machines, and we aligned the digital data so you can see all the differences. And the one in Salt Lake is pitched back a little further, and his hands are higher, and the one that the Copenhagen one is pitched a little more forward, which was kind of fun to look at a comparison on.
And to clarify, that happened because when that Christus was created, it was just done by hand.
Right, because there was no technology to do that. And since, because the Rome temple ended up taking a long time, we were working on the temple in France, and there's a small visitor center there. And we were originally just going to put a resin statue off of this same data. I had a couple of 8-foot ones made. I put one in London at the Hyde Park Chapel. We had a little visitor center there. I put one in Portland, Oregon, at the temple there. And then we were having one made for France, and President Uchtdorf came over to visit on a review session one time. And he said something to the effect of, well, how come you're putting the Christ statue inside? One of the beautiful things about France is there's the temple, and then kind of these outer buildings that surround a beautiful garden in the center. And he said, you ought to put that outside. And he had just been to Italy to see the statues. The temple wasn't near being done there, but he had seen the statues, and he said, well, why don't you just put the same marble statue there that you're doing for Rome, put it in France? And I said, well, because I don't have a second one. And he didn't care about that. So what we ended up doing was having a second one made and putting it there in France in the gardens. But you can imagine the difference between a resin statue that weighs a couple 100 pounds and a marble statue that weighs, 14, 16, 18 ton, depending on what base you put on it. And underneath that section is a parking garage. So they had to go re-engineer how to hold this thing up because it was so heavy. But we got, so there's one there as well.
Will you stop sharing so your screen is bigger and then show your statue again?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if it's within view there. So there is which is pretty amazing, just the detail on it. So that is an exact replica of the one in Copenhagen. You'll notice things like they call this a bifurcated chin, where he has a big cleft in his chin. The bifurcation on the Copenhagen statue is a lot more distinct than any of the other ones that you'll find around. We're probably out of time. I can tell you a quick story about the mural.
Great.
Oh yeah, tell us about that.
So there's a let's see, this mural back here. We needed to have that mural and another one done, and they had already commissioned the murals for the temple, and so those artists were busy. And I had found someone I thought, and he didn't quite, he wasn't quite, anyway, he wasn't the right fit. And so I was struggling because, again, we thought the timeline was shorter, and I was really nervous about this, and I kept trying to find an artist that would paint this mural. I mean, this thing is massive, this mural is. And if you've ever worked with the church and art, it's quite a process because it has to go through about 17 levels of approval, and everyone has an opinion of how it should look and what it should be like. And so I needed someone who would sign up for it and not give up in the process. And I used to ride the train from Orem up to downtown Salt Lake. And I got on the train one morning, and a gentleman sat down next to me, and he said, how's your wife doing, Marin? And I looked down and I said, she's doing great. And I did not recognize him. And then he reminded me that he and his wife had lived in her ward at one point, and that they knew him very well. In fact, so much so, he's an artist. He had given us a painting for a painting of Marin's choosing for our wedding, and so she got this painting. So anyway, we got talking and just catching up on how he was doing. He had just been over in Italy working on a project and blah blah blah. And then we got done talking, and I went back to work, and I had this I'm sitting there and I went, wait a second, this guy's an artist. He's just been in Italy, but he did a lot of sculpture stuff. And so I said, I know you paint or you draw. Have you ever done a mural? He's like, oh yeah, done tons of murals. I said, how big? And he told me, and I go, is there any chance you'd be interested in doing a couple of murals for the Rome Temple Visitor Center? And he just about fell on the floor. He's like, are you serious? He's like, that would be amazing, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, through that funny little connection on a train one morning, Joseph Bricky and I connected again, and he ended up being the artist on a couple of murals, this one included, which ended up really beautiful, as you can see.
What I love about that story is God works that way so many times. I mean, you could look and say, oh, that's a coincidence that you got on that train the same day. That's not a coincidence. That's God directing our lives. And if we look for those things and we're willing to recognize them, then he blesses us with more of them. But that's part of choosing to believe. When we choose to believe, we choose to say, yes, that is God's hand in our lives.
Pretty amazing. Yeah, I sat right next to him on a train that I rode every single day, and I actually never saw him again.
Anybody else have any questions that you'd like to ask? Just make sure you unmute yourself if you're asking a question.
Well, now you're required to tell your parents you have to go to Italy and see the statues for real life. Yes. Awesome, huh?
What do you say? Okay, well, thank you very much. Fascinating story. I love hearing that story, and it just, I mean, you can see God's hand in so many points along that process, and just love that. So is there anyone that would be willing to say our closing prayer? Thanks to Lydia for saying our opening prayer.
I'll say the prayer.
Awesome, thank you.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank thee for our blessings. Thank thee that we could come to this fireside and learn something new, and that all of us are doing well. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.